Hello, I'm Smith and Harris. As you probably gathered from the thumbnail, you already know what today's discussion is about. Yes, you guessed it right. At a time when the world seems to be trembling at the prospect of a third world war, with America's advanced military power on one side and Iran's unwavering stance on the other, these two longtime rivals surprised everyone by agreeing to hold talks in Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan. But why? Why did they step back from the brink of conflict and choose diplomacy instead? And did these discussions lead to any meaningful outcome? Let's take a closer look. First, it's important to understand how this tense atmosphere developed. The hostility between the United States and Iran is rooted in years of accumulated grievances, along with deep strategic interests on both sides. The United States aims to protect its allies in the region, particularly Israel and Saudi Arabia, while also maintaining its influence in the Middle East. Iran, on the other hand, seeks to remove the American military presence from the region and establish itself as a dominant regional power. A major point of conflict is Iran's nuclear program. The United States believes that Iran may be secretly developing nuclear weapons, which it sees as a serious threat to global security. Iran, however, insists that its nuclear ambitions are entirely peaceful. This deep mistrust continues to push both nations dangerously close to conflict. Beyond direct confrontation, the two countries are also engaged in proxy conflicts across several nations, including Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. Tensions rise whenever groups backed by one side target the interests of the other. Another critical factor is oil. A large portion of the world's oil supply passes through this region. If Iran were to disrupt key shipping routes, it could trigger major economic consequences, not just for the United States, but for the global economy. For years, the United States has imposed strict economic sanctions on Iran, putting significant pressure on its economy. These sanctions have fueled resentment within Iran's leadership, which believes that only by demonstrating strength can it push for their removal. At the same time, internal political pressures in both countries often encourage leaders to take a hardline stance, as projecting strength can be politically advantageous at home. This conflict, therefore, is not just about two nations. It is a long-standing struggle over power, resources, and survival. However, despite rising tensions, both sides have recently chosen to engage in dialogue. In March and April, military tensions escalated to a point where the possibility of a full-scale war felt very real. Yet neither the United States nor Iran appears willing to enter a prolonged and costly conflict at this time. Iran's economy is currently under significant strain due to ongoing sanctions and recent instability. Through negotiations, it hopes to ease some of that pressure. Meanwhile, the United States is also cautious. Another major conflict in the Middle East could drive up global fuel prices and negatively impact its domestic economy, especially during an election period. The United States is primarily focused on limiting Iran's nuclear program and ensuring the safety of its regional allies, particularly Israel. Iran, in turn, is seeking guarantees against potential U.S. military action and wants to safeguard its sovereignty. Additionally, the Strait of Hormuz remains a critical global shipping route for oil. Rising tensions have already threatened its stability, making it a priority for both nations to ensure safe passage and avoid disruptions that could impact the global economy. The talks were scheduled to take place in Pakistan, but why Pakistan? The answer lies in its diplomatic position. Pakistan maintains relatively balanced relations with both the United States and Iran, making it a suitable neutral ground for dialogue. With this objective in mind, both countries agreed to hold discussions in Islamabad. This historic meeting between the United States and Iran took place in Pakistan's capital on April 11 and 12. The U.S. delegation was led by Vice President J.D. Vance, while the Iranian delegation was headed by Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bakr Ghalibaf and Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Despite hours of intense discussions, the two sides were unable to reach a final agreement. However, the meeting is still being regarded as one of the highest-level direct engagements between Washington and Tehran in the past 50 years. Even before the talks officially began, tensions escalated sharply. Iran made it clear that it would not fully engage in discussions unless certain conditions were met. Most notably, the implementation of a ceasefire in Lebanon. Tehran accused Israel of carrying out continuous attacks in the region. According to reports, recent strikes in Lebanon resulted in the deaths of 20 people, including 12 security personnel. Iranian leaders, including Mohammad Bakr Ghalibaf and Abbas Araghchi, stated that negotiations could not move forward unless two key demands were addressed: a ceasefire in Lebanon and the release of Iran's frozen financial assets. Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister Saeed Khatibzadeh described the ongoing attacks as serious violations and delivered a strong message, urging the United States to choose between war and a ceasefire. In response, U.S. President Donald Trump issued a firm warning. He stated that if the Islamabad talks failed, Iran could face further military action he described as potentially severe. Despite the rising tension, the possibility of dialogue was not entirely lost. Vice President J.D. Vance traveled to Islamabad with a cautiously optimistic tone, stating that the United States was open to meaningful engagement if Iran approached the talks sincerely. At the same time, he made it clear that the U.S. would not tolerate any attempts at deception under the cover of diplomacy. The discussions lasted for nearly 21 hours, beginning on April 11 and continuing into the morning of April 12. However, despite the lengthy negotiations, no breakthrough was achieved. In the end, the talks concluded without any concrete resolution. Following the collapse of diplomatic talks with Iran and Pakistan, U.S. President Donald Trump announced on Sunday that, beginning Monday, the United States would intercept cargo vessels transiting through the Strait of Hormuz. However, officials also clarified that certain exceptions would apply. Acting on Trump's directive, United States Central Command released a statement on social media, confirming that the blockade would be enforced uniformly across all nations. According to the statement, any vessel attempting to enter or leave Iranian ports would be subject to interception. This directive extends to Iranian ports along both the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. However, U.S. forces will not interfere with vessels simply passing through the Strait of Hormuz, as long as they have no interaction with Iranian ports. In such cases, freedom of navigation will be preserved. U.S. military authorities also stated that detailed guidance will be issued to mariners through formal notifications before the blockade takes effect. President Trump further stated that he intends to take action against any country that pays tariffs to Iran in exchange for using the Strait of Hormuz. He described such payments as illegal and emphasized that the blockade is being implemented to prevent this practice. At the same time, he announced that the United States would begin operations to neutralize naval mines reportedly deployed by Iran in the Strait, following the escalation of tensions with the U.S. and Israel. In his words, no one who pays these illegal tariffs will be able to travel safely. And if Iran attacks us, or if any peaceful vessel is targeted, we will respond with overwhelming force. In response, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued a strong counter-warning. It stated that any military vessel approaching the Strait of Hormuz would be considered a violation of the ceasefire and would be met with a forceful response. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf directly addressed the United States, declaring, "If you choose war, we will respond in kind." The 2-week ceasefire announced earlier now appears increasingly fragile. Meanwhile, China has once again entered the equation. China's Defense Minister Dong Jun stated that Beijing is closely monitoring developments in the Middle East. He emphasized that Chinese vessels regularly transit through the Strait of Hormuz and that China maintains critical trade and energy agreements with Iran, interests it is prepared to defend at any cost. Why is China willing to take this risk? At the heart of China's position are significant economic interests. Analysts point out that Iran is one of China's key sources of crude oil. Any disruption in the Strait of Hormuz would directly threaten China's energy security. Additionally, Beijing views this move by the United States as a form of interference that could impact its broader economic interests. Why is the U.S. increasing pressure on China? The pressure stems from multiple strategic factors. U.S. officials have cited intelligence reports suggesting that China may be providing military support to Iran. Based on this, President Trump has threatened to impose a 50% tariff on Chinese goods. Previously, the United States applied similar pressure by restricting China's access to Venezuelan oil. Now, by targeting Iran, Washington appears to be attempting to limit China's energy supply once again. In effect, by confronting Iran, the United States is pursuing two objectives at once: maintaining its dominance in the Middle East, while simultaneously putting economic pressure on China. The Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most critical oil transit routes in the world. If U.S. forces were to fully blockade Iranian ports, it could trigger a global energy crisis. Iran has already issued a counter-threat, warning that no port in the Gulf would remain safe, an escalation that signals the potential for a much larger conflict.